Today's lesson is on solving radical equations. As usual, we have a video guide to go along with the lesson. If you haven't printed it, go ahead and pause the video, print, and then come back. So for solving radical equations, the first thing that we need to know is what is a radical equation. So the term radical equation just means an equation with a square root. The term radical in mathematics deals with this square root symbol. Okay, so when you see radical equation, it just means that there's a square root in the equation. So if we're going to take a look at the first example, we just have the square root of x equals 4. And I just want to talk about this radical equation for a moment. So what we're looking for is x, and we're trying to figure out what number, when I take the square root of it, am I going to get 4? So, if we think that through, okay, the square root of a number means that we're looking for a number that multiplies by itself to get the number under the square root. So if I multiply my number by itself, that will tell me what goes under the square root. So 4 times 4, I know that x should be 16. Because if I check that, the square root of 16 is 4. So I know that this is my answer. Now let's talk about how we can get there and how we would show our work for that. So all I did to find 16 was to multiply 4 times itself, 4 times 4. In our previous lesson, we talked about squares and square roots, and we said that when we square a number, it means that we multiply that number by itself. So essentially, what I did to get from 4 to 16 was I squared the 4. I multiplied it by itself. Now, whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other as well. So we actually squared this side as well. Now, this is hard for a lot of people to see because the symbols are so different. Okay, the square root symbol is so different from raising it to the second power, squaring it. But those are actually opposites of each other. Okay? When you take the square root of a number, when you square a number like 5, take it to the second power, we would get 25. When you take the square root of that number, 25, we get back to the original 5. So squaring the number and then square rooting it, it undoes each other. So that we end up with the same number that we started with, the 5. So that's what's happening here. When I take the square root of x and then I also square it, essentially what's happening is those cancel out. Just like multiplying and dividing by the same number cancels each other out, or adding and subtracting by the same number cancels them out, square rooting and squaring a number or a term just cancels out the square root and the square. So all that we have left is x. So this is what we're going to be using to solve our equations today. You must remember that the opposite of a square root is raising it to the second power, or squaring it. So let's take a look at some of our examples. Number 1, we have the square root of k equals 10. So to solve this, I need to get rid of the square root, the radical. We just talked about the opposite of a square root is to take it to the second power. So all I'm going to do is square both sides. My square root and my exponent cancel out. They are opposites of each other, even though they don't look like opposites. The k comes down, and 10 to the second power just means 10 times 10, which is 100. So k equals 100 is my answer. Number 2. A little bit more complicated. We have the square root of x plus 5 equals 9. Now, when we're solving an equation that has a square root, anytime you have a letter and a number underneath the square root together, it's as if they were in parentheses. They just don't write it in the problem. It's an assumption. They assume that you know those are in parentheses together. So those actually get separated last. The first thing that you need to get rid of is the square root. So again, to cancel out the square root, we would square both sides. The square root and the square cancel, nothing happens to the x and the 5. Because they were under the square root's all that gets canceled out, the x plus 5 stays the same. Now on the right hand side, 9 squared just means 9 times 9, which is 81. Now at this point, we're still not finished. X is not by itself. We need to cancel out the positive 5. The opposite of positive 5 or plus 5 is subtract 5, minus 5 on both sides. 5 minus 5 is 0, so they cancel. I get x equals 81 minus 5 is 76. So x equals 76 is my solution. Let's look at the next example, number 3. We have 8 equals the square root of 4p. Again, the 4 and the p are as if they were in parentheses together. They're grouped together. So I need to get rid of the square root first. And the opposite of a square root is to square it. So I'm going to square both sides. 8 squared just means 8 times 8, which is 64, equals the square root and the square cancel. The 4p does not change, okay? All that we're doing is getting rid of the square root. So 64 equals 4p, we're almost done. I need to cancel out the 4. Now remember, if a number and a letter are right next to each other, that means multiplication. So the opposite of multiplying is divide. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4. So my 4's here cancel. I'm left with p. 64 divided by 4 is 16. So 16 equals p is our solution. Okay, number 4. We have the square root of f over 7 equals 3. Draw our line through the equal sign. Again, the f and the 7, it's as if they were in parentheses together. They're grouped together. You need to get rid of the square root first. So to get rid of a square root, we square both sides. Take it to the second power. The square root and the square cancel. My f over 7 does not change. Okay, that has not been touched. 3 to the second power just means 3 times 3, which is 9. Now this fraction, remember, fractions are not scary in equations. It just means f divided by 7. Okay, a fraction means the same thing as division. So if I'm dividing by 7, the opposite would be to multiply by 7. So I multiply both sides by 7. They cancel, I get f equals 63 for my solution. All right, number 5. Our problem is the square root of 5g plus 4 equals 7. Again, think of the parentheses.
2.
Our last two problems, 7 and 8. Again, you need to make sure that you get rid of the square root first by squaring both sides and then solve the equation. For number 7, you should get that w equals 37. If you did not, go ahead and pause the video, check your work with mine. And lastly, number 8. Again, I squared both sides and then I got y by itself. You should get that 14 equals y. Make sure you check your work with mine. And that concludes our lesson on solving radical equations.